Welcome this week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. This week we're talking about the State House. The legislative session is more than halfway over. The House has passed its version of the budget, and there's still plenty of bills in play that we'll be talking about. And filing for State House seats, the governor, constitutional officers, U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and more have also opened up. So there's a lot to talk about. So for updates and analysis on all of this, I'm joined by one of our favorite panels around our trapezoid. It's another round table, including Jeffrey Collins with the Associated Press, Joe Bustos with the State Newspaper, and Maayan Schechter here with SCETV. Welcome back, guys. Good to see you.
Good to be
Thanks
here.
for having us.
It's been since January the last time we all caught up, late January. A lot has changed since then, Jeffrey, especially as we're past that midway point in session. As we approach May 14th, sine die, the last day of this two-year session. A lot needs to get done, but we've already seen some action, like I was saying, including a bit of a surprise when it came to the NIL bill that the governor just recently vetoed. This bill would keep those contracts, those revenue-sharing deals between athletes, teams, and universities and colleges secret, not foilable. There were some concerns about this. We've been kind of zipped through the House. There's some good debate in the Senate, but then again, we saw the governor veto it. What was the message there? What was his problem with this bill?
So we'll open with Jeffrey with sports. And, it's a complex issue because in part college sports is just a mess. The rules are ever changing. There's all sorts of things going on. Whatever they pass this year, they'll probably have to come back next year and do something else, and the year after that maybe to do something else until there is some federal solution to all this. But what's going on right now in South Carolina is the payments to student athletes. They are secret, not just on the athlete level, but the schools also want them secret as far as how much money they pay each team. So they don't want you to know they're paying the football team $18 million and the women's basketball team $2 million. They don't want their other schools to know that. They don't want their competitors to know that. So they've asked the legislature to pass a law so it would be exempt from public records law. Like you said, it zipped through the House. The Senate, there was a little bit of a snag because there was some question about whether or not the written testimony from athletic directors was complete enough. So we did hear from athletic directors right before they had a vote. The vote was 30-13, which is pretty good. We'll get to why that's important in just a second. So it goes to the governor. The governor is concerned about sunshine and openness. He doesn't want the individual athletic contracts, like how much each person gets paid, to be public, even if they redact the names and things like that. But he thinks that the amounts that get paid to each team should be out there. That if you're a fan of South Carolina, you should know how much they're paying the softball team versus the basketball team, the men's basketball team. So he kicks it back, and it passed the House. There's only 2 votes against it in the House. So it's going to get through that. They're going to override the veto without a problem. The Senate is a little trickier proposition. Like I said, it was 30-13 vote. You need 2/3 in the Senate to override. And so you got to get to 31. There are 3 people out. I mean, I think, if you asked me to put a bet on it, I would think it probably gets through the Senate. But if it doesn't mean the end of the world for these colleges either that say that, because what prompted all this is a lawsuit. Somebody, a businessman, that's kind of a open records person. He filed a lawsuit asking for this information. So it just gets kicked back to the court, which has to determine under South Carolina's FOIA statute if it can be released. So this was just kind of a protective measure to keep it from happening.
And Jeffrey, the concern really is just concerns about taxpayer dollars, taxpayer dollars, as well as private dollars and any commingling. That's really like the root of a lot of this too.
Right, and that's because all of a sudden there's all this influx of money that's come into college sports. Like, you didn't used to pay athletes, and now you have to pay them. There's money that comes in from, there's $20+ million that comes in that you can share, but then there's extra money that comes involved with adding scholarships and things like that. And so, schools are having to dip into different funds. And so that's what concerned the senators is, are you dipping into, public money that comes in to pay this stuff? And, in Clemson's case, Clemson made the point, well, yes, but, like we're just trying to juggle all these pots of money. So every once in a while we might have to pull from something. We're not doing it on a regular basis, and we're not paying athletes with this. It's just a matter of trying to get all the money together in one place when suddenly it was just a completely different atmosphere.
Yeah. So we'll see. The House is out this week, so we'll see what happens when they come back and things start moving again, and if they have the votes. And maybe they might reconsider that too, because now that there's a different lens on this, That could be a different vote
Could
too.
easily be, yes.
TBD.
March Madness coming to the
Oh, there it is. Thank you, Jeffrey. Maayan, speaking of money and revenue, we saw that the House did pass its $15.4 billion budget. That's why they're on furlough this week. They take that week off typically after they pass the budget. You covered very closely as well as Joe. What were some of the highlights from this spending plan? And again, maybe what stood out to you, some of the amendments, some of that elongated debate, if anything really changed, the meat of the budget really changed at all?
Right, and I, it is rare, and I will never say it never happens, because we have seen dollars change on the floor, but I mean, very rarely, especially the last few years, do we see the budget really take an overhaul approach on the floor from the Ways and Means Committee to what they do in the House. As you mentioned, this is a roughly $15.4 billion state spending plan. It includes what a lot of the governor's wish list, maybe not fully to the amount of what he wanted, but especially the $150 million to raise the starting teacher pay to that $50,500 amount. And that is a significant increase from when the governor first took office, when it was below $40,000. We've saw money, about $500 million for the State Department of Transportation, a lot of that money for bridge modernization, interstate. We saw money for tax relief, money for the medical university so that they can build a new cancer hospital, money for the Captain Sam's Spit settlement. That had a lot of debate on the floor, especially with the Hardline House Freedom Caucus. Millions and millions and millions of dollars for healthcare related initiatives, whether it's at the University of South Carolina or covering certain Medicaid costs, or going toward even money for SNAP, dealing with some of the federal cuts coming down the road. So this was a pretty typical budget. Now, as you mentioned, it's going over to the Senate, and as we're talking about changes and what those changes could look like, that's really where I think some of the tougher debate is going to happen. Of course, right after the House passed their budget, which included enough money to lower the top state income tax rate from the 6% to 5.39%. They passed another income tax bill, lowering it even more to the 5.21%. And of course, they passed the tax conformity legislation, all of which is not funded through the state budget. So now the Senate is going to have to deal with exactly how they're going to pay for those two bills, especially considering now it appears that tax conformity legislation is going to go through. So that'll be an interesting debate over in the Senate. But going back to some of the changes, again, we did not see a whole lot of changes occur on the floor. We saw the Freedom Caucus put up a lot of very expected measures, going after Clemson University, going after the salaries of some of the agency directors that they're not big fans of, like Dr. Edward Simmer, who's the interim public health director. We also saw them go after certain agencies, their budgets total. We also saw them going after programs. Again, most of those, except for, I think, one proviso maybe that the Freedom Caucus proposed, actually wound up sticking. We did see some provisos get attached dealing with the oversight of the South Carolina High School League, again, kind of getting around if that bill, that standalone bill, does not pass, but not a whole lot of changes from what we saw coming out of the Ways and Means Committee.
Yeah, and Joe, a lot of times people use the budget as this way to advance some policy initiatives in proviso form or through funding in some sense, even though it never seems to actually take root, to try and advance some things that they can't get done through typical bills, doing those provisos, those one-year laws that we've seen take effect, especially when it comes to the bathroom bill, which we'll talk about in a moment. But did anything else jump out to you in this budget debate that you were covering as well?
I think one thing about the budget debate is anyone can talk about anything and everything they want to.
Yeah.
And it's campaign season, so we saw some attempts at some campaigning on the floor. Jermaine Johnson tried to get the expand Medicaid proviso. That was quickly shot down on a germaneness issue. Ironically enough. But back to the Captain Sam Spit issue. Supporters of Lieutenant Governor Pamela Vett's campaign for governor used that as an opportunity to go after Alan Wilson. And it was kind of like an audition tape to be on Evett's ticket. It was called out by Bruce Bannister, who also happens to be an Evett supporter. Obviously, that $32 million stayed in the budget with no issue.
Yeah, and then we also saw, I guess, they fund the school breakfast, free breakfast across the state.
Right, that was out of the Ways and Means Committee as well.
Free breakfast made it in. Lottery vending machines were knocked out.
Oh, okay, well, we'll see what the Senate does. Again, that's over in the Senate now, and they're debating that too. But Joe, we're taping this episode on Wednesday. We typically do this on Thursday, so we have a little bit better idea what happens on Wednesdays because they're always such big legislative days. But we're seeing that debate continuing in the Senate right now with the hemp derived consumable bills. The hemp derived consumable bill, H3924, which deals with like Delta 9 drinks. There's debate over gummies and regulations of all these things because right now it's not regulated. This is legal under the 2018 Farm Bill. What's going on with that right now? It's expected to be a long day this Wednesday, so I'm not going to ask you to tell me what happened because we don't know yet, but where do things stand right now with that bill?
So the bill would restrict the drinks, the THC drinks, to anyone 21 or over. It would also restrict where they could be sold, some lower doses in grocery stores and convenience stores, some of the higher doses in liquor stores. There was attempts to outright ban them. Those votes failed. It's going to be a long debate. I think gummies would not be allowed. So I think we'll see what happens with it, and it also has to get through the House chamber again as well. So
yeah, and that's the thing. This came over from the House. It was pretty loosely regulated in that original version, just dealing with folks 21 and under not being able to purchase or consume these consumables, which are pretty popular right now. And that's why it's also pretty difficult, too, when you see statements coming out from the SCETV saying that this is not on our party platform, but then you also have some Republicans who are like, well, actually, a lot of my constituents enjoy these. So I wonder if it's going to be somewhat of a election issue as well for these House members.
We'll see. I mean, especially when the SCGOP has come out with repeated press releases on this particular bill. And then we saw what happened with the hemp bill on the House side, and there's some disagreement about how to move forward with that one.
Yeah, because if nothing happens, then nothing's going to continue to happen when it comes to regulation on this. So a little bit of incentive there. But Jeffrey, I'm going to stick with you for another surprise this legislative session, and that came with the state Supreme Court election, that race for Justice John Cannon Few's seat. He was up for re-election, usually a rubber stamp process for these folks, these incumbents, unless there's a major concern that's been brought up via the vetting process. And this year it appeared to be the case. There's also been a lot of intense pressure on the entire judicial selection process, which of course our lawmakers, all 170 of them, choose the judges in the state compared to other states, which is popular election in different ways. But walk us through this situation, the politics of this race, and what happened there.
Judicial elections have a surprising amount of drama in South Carolina. Even the ones that we don't hear about have a surprising amount of drama. This was by far the most interesting judicial race that I can recall. So Justice John Few, he's on the court right now, he's Associate Justice. He was running for re-election. What ended up happening is he cast the deciding vote on the first abortion ruling, the one that overturned the first law that was passed. 3-2 vote. Like I said, he was the swing vote. And when he wrote his opinion piece, he was very careful to say, if you do the following things, legislature, I will be able to vote in favor of it if it comes back around to me. And sure enough, he did. He gave him a roadmap and he did that. But that, as you can imagine, ticked off a number of lawmakers. And in this world too, sometimes, and John Few has an interesting personality, that might be a way of putting it. And sometimes when somebody ticks you off like that,
sure,
then suddenly you start concentrating on their personality and they start getting bothered, so he started to get less and less support. So the race came down to 4 candidates: Few, Blake Hewitt, Ralph Anderson, and former Speaker Jay Lucas. So that became interesting. Jay Lucas is a lawyer. He hasn't practiced a whole lot because he's been doing legislative stuff and everything. Hasn't been a judge, certainly. He was a judge in Hartsville for like a year, a city judge. So the controversy became, can we elevate somebody with that limited amount of judicial experience to be a Supreme Court justice? And so the House supports Jay Lucas because obviously he was in most of the House, I should say, because he was their leader. And they've got 124 votes compared to 46 for the Senate. So they've got a massive numerical advantage. Well, some very powerful people in the Senate did think that's a bad idea. Don't think that you should elevate somebody with no judicial experience to one of the top judicial jobs in the state. Shane Massey took the Senate floor to speak out against it, which was another
It's very vintage Massey, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, it was like, let's go back to 2008 and watch him throw bombs. It was very
because he was talking about the perception of favoritism and this perception of corruption that continues to be discussed, and then to have that revolving door in a sense kind of gives that idea. So, but then what happened after that?
Well, and what got missed in that too is that Luke Rankin wrote a letter that basically said the same things Massey did. It just, didn't get quite as much attention because it was in the middle of a massive report. So what ended up happening is we got one day before the election and few decided to drop out. Typically, most judicial elections, that happens quite frequently. Like if you have 3 candidates, the 2 that realize they aren't going to get votes drop out. So there's not, it just ends in a very happy kind of way, right?
Yeah, everyone gets along.
Yeah, everybody's happy we're all getting along. But because few's an incumbent, that completely voided that race. It didn't take place, no elections took place. They're gonna have to go all the way back to the screening process, which typically takes 6 months. So, they've made no effort to start screening. So there's not going to be a new justice elected this session, it doesn't look like. So we're going to be running all the way through the end of this year without that justice.
Yeah, because his term is up this summer, and then of course, like you're saying, that restart everything. And it would have changed if he dropped out the day of versus the day before, but we love the drama, and we certainly got it. So.
Well, and it throws a complete bomb into that race.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody, the candidates, anybody can run again. So we had 4 candidates this time. We could have 8 next time. If we have 8, then let's the Judicial Merit Screening Commission, which does the screening, they have to cull that off by a few. So suddenly they're going to may have to make a decision. Well, this candidate cannot be in the legislative race. Last but not least, Jay Lucas is, there's a limit to when judges have to retire. Jay Lucas is close to that. He'll be even closer a year from now. He says he's going to blow right past it. He says it doesn't apply to me because I'm not taking a pension. So it's going to be an interesting mess next year.
And then you really start looking at experience. If you don't even have judicial experience, then do you make the cut in the first place?
But that may be
sure. There's going to be a lot of machinations going on.
Oh, just wait until next year when we do all this screening again.
Something to look forward to, Jeffrey.
Of course.
Maayan, you were talking about taxes a minute ago when we were talking about the budget and some of it not being fully funded, but kind of drill down a little bit further on what we're seeing with the movement when it comes to taxes. We're seeing that personal income tax bill making its way to the governor's desk. There were changes made by the Senate that the House was kind of surprised by, but went along with anyway. So tell us about that, possibly homestead exemption. And if you really want to get wonky, you can talk about tax conformity.
Yes,
There's so many things going on this year when it comes to taxes.
Another bit of a surprise that happened this legislative cycle. So the income tax legislation is going to the governor's desk. It's on the governor's desk. He is likely to sign it. He's obviously been very, very supportive of any kind of tax cut legislation, right? And this is a bill that not only at least attempts to kind of level the playing field with all taxpayers in South Carolina, but it also has the end goal, now this could take years or decades, to completely phase the income tax out. And as we've noted previously and repeatedly, and I do think it's a very important point, is that the income tax revenue makes up a sizable portion of the state budget every year. So without that revenue, it'll be interesting to see what that budget looks like and how the budget debates go. So that is one bill. You then have the homestead exemption property tax expansion bill. That is a bill that was pushed by Senate Finance Committee Chairman Harvey Peeler. That bill is really, I think, up in question right now. The House has not done anything with it. There has been some comments made by the House Ways and Means Committee Chair, Bruce Bannister, that sort of puts that legislation in question. Of course, that's a bill for those who are 65 years and older. There has been a lot of concern about that bill, particularly given the fact that South Carolina is such a growing state, and it's growing in one particular age range. And that
some of our viewers might be affected by this.
That happens to be a lot of folks who are coming to South Carolina to retire, in part because of the tax structure here in the state. So again, you never want to say that you can't be surprised by the legislature, because I move on to tax conformity, which we were all told by the House Budget Chair that they wouldn't probably discuss this bill until after the April 15th deadline. And then Senate GOP leaders essentially said, I think on the record repeatedly, that they didn't have any intention of taking up tax conformity. And then look where we are. The House passes tax conformity. I will mention that that occurred right before they did go on furlough, correct? But also right before the March filing began. So they go on furlough, they pass that bill, and then the Senate Finance Committee has now advanced that bill to the floor. Senator Peeler did say that there are likely to be amendments, so it could very well go back to the House. But again, it's becoming kind of clear that there perhaps has been some obvious outside pressure, not just from the CPAs, which we've heard a lot about, but also taxpayers themselves who want to see the state, who want to reap the benefits of what the federal tax code changes did under President Trump's so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. I think tax policy legislation, which, Maayan at the start of her state house career would have said, absolutely no way are we going to see this legislation go through. I remember sitting in every tax policy ad hoc committee makeup you could think of. Now we're at the point where these are bills and debates that are really dominating the conversation. And I should mention, they are not cheap, which again, going back to the budget, is going to be something where the House and Senate are going to have to figure out what exactly they want to cut. It also could, potentially impact the want to give out earmarks. We heard from both chairs that they were going to do earmarks this year. Well, certainly that could have some impact on that. So the amount of dollars, both annual and one-time, are starting to get much, much, much smaller.
Yeah, and of course, like we've been talking about too on State House today, like we've seen these revenues starting to kind of taper off too, like since the sugar high of the COVID, federal stimulus money, and then of course with all the growth coming to the state. But things are kind of slowing down a little bit, like, as they've been predicting to happen eventually, and now we're kind of there. Of course, this also happens to be the year when they want to do all these tax cuts, which reduces the revenue
right.
coming in too.
Right.
So, but of course, it's also an election year where we have on the gubernatorial campaign trail folks talk about the tax rates we have. You have folks in the State House who are up for early election. You also talk about property versus income taxes, and that's where you're talking about the homestead exemption. So it will be interesting to see what actually makes it through. But of course, we know that personal income tax cut is on the governor's desk. Homestead might be something for next session. TBD.
In question.
Don't want to
yeah.
say anything. But Joe, let's talk about some of those controversial bills that we were dealing with early in session from the House. Talking about the 10 Commandments having to be displayed in every classroom, the abortion-inducing pill bill, and then of course, where am I going with this? The bathroom bill too for all public schools and colleges. Those all passed the House, again, up for re-election this year, but they're in the Senate. Do we have any idea about where those bills are going and what might be their future?
Yeah, so those are good primary bills for Republican lawmakers. The 10 Commandments bill, it's in committee. I think the Senate Majority Leader told us that previous iterations of this bill that have come through had a hard time gaining traction or even being enforced. The bathroom bill, that one passed out of a Senate committee and is on the calendar. It probably will come up after the THC bill. So I think that one will be interesting to watch. And then you'll have the abortion pill. I think before session started, Majority Leader Shane Massey said dealing with mail order abortion pills and trying to restrict those would be something that could get some interest in the Senate because they passed a 6-week law. They didn't want to deal with too much with abortion after that, but they want to get around this loophole that they've seen as formed.
Yeah, and reclassifying those abortion-inducing pills like mifepristone to Schedule 4 controlled substance, which is the crux of it. Then we'll see what some of those other bills going through, because they have been challenged too in other states and even within our own state when it comes to the bathroom bill too. So a lot to go with that. We have about 5 minutes left, and I haven't talked about elections yet, even though we've been alluding to them. But Maayan, really quickly, I just want to ask you about charter school oversight. That was supposed to be a big deal this year, but we also, I guess we're talking about tax dollars being used for private things potentially, especially when it comes to charter schools, school choice, education, scholarship trust funds, whatever you want to call it. But there was a pretty contentious hearing earlier this session dealing with the state superintendent of education when it came to how some of those funds were going to homeschool children. So walk us through that and what's the latest with that?
Yeah, so let me just quickly mention the charter school authorization because really there is legislation that is moving through the legislature that really would provide greater oversight, transparency over charter school authorizers. That bill passed the Senate. That bill is now in the House, and we have seen, particularly the House Ways Committee, House Ways and Means Committee, and also the Education Chairwoman Shannon Erickson really go at authorizers, particularly Erskine, one of the biggest ones in the state. So I would expect, given the fact that you have both chambers that seem pretty intent on putting a bit more guardrails over the charter school authorizers, to see that move through. Now, as it relates to the Education Scholarship Trust Fund, so senators became aware, so did House members, but senators have taken particular interest in this, became aware of the fact that students who were essentially being schooled at home were also receiving these stipends, taxpayer dollars, through the Education Scholarship Trust Fund law. Lawmakers have been pretty clear throughout the debate that this money was never intended to go to students who were learning at home. Now, the Education Department has created this term for this classification of students called unbundlers. Senators will argue that, you can call it whatever you want. These are homeschooled students who are taking advantage of these public tax dollars, when a lot of homeschool parents during the debate over this law specifically said that they did not want the money because they saw that as potentially a road to greater state government oversight, and they don't want that in their child's education. Senate Education Chairman Greg Hembury has a bill that would largely deal with this issue, remove these so-called unbundlers from the program, but he has also acknowledged that this bill is probably going to have a hard time getting through, not so much the Senate, because I think the Senate seems pretty unified over the fact that they feel like they were tricked or lied to, but having a serious issue getting through the House. So Senator Greg Hembury has said on multiple occasions that perhaps the way that they deal with this issue is going through the state budget. So for example, the Education Department had asked for, I think it was somewhere in the $60 million range, to go over the 15,000 student cap for this program. The House did not fund that. They only put about $23 million in, so they can go to that 15,000 student cap. But Senator Hembury said in a meeting that perhaps we should not even allow that cap to go there. So maybe we need to keep the student population, enrollment population as is right now. So I think where we're going to see the debate is through the budget. Now, does that stick when they start negotiating with the House? A little tricky, but I mean, I think, the Senate seems very, very unified over the fact that they are not very happy with the Education Department.
A lot to watch there. And Jeffrey, of course, we've run out of time, but with a minute left, anything that you're thinking might also be dead for the session? We talked about in January that some big bills that are dead for the session, but also maybe some sage wisdom as we enter this election season, what folks should be looking for.
Well, you mentioned medical marijuana as being a dead bill, but it may come back in the hemp debate. Let's wait and see what happens.
THC,
Could be. And, election season, the one thing I'd say about South Carolina is if you're an incumbent, get 50% because you don't want to end up in a runoff. That would be my advice, because you get in a runoff and you got 40%, that means 60% of the people didn't like you. So get to that 50%.
Words of wisdom there. That's Jeffrey Collins with the Associated Press, Joe Bustos with the state newspaper, Maayan Schechter with SCETV. I'm Gavin Jackson for South Carolina TV. Be well, South Carolina.